ladies and gentlemen, it is of great importance that we are meeting here today at what is indeed a portentous moment in European history. My name is David Marsh, and I have the great pleasure of leading this consolidated round now for the next 2 hours. It's not very often that the British get a chance to lead anything in Europe these days, apart from the inflation rate. So it's a double privilege for me to be here, to be in charge of this session. I think we also need to reflect on the words that have been spoken now in the opening remarks. This is indeed a place in Poland where the earth has moved, where events of great importance did take place. And as has been said, it was only 22 years ago when the Berlin Wall fell. I was here on that weekend, just before the weekend, with Helmut Kohl. I was then a journalist working for the Financial Times, accompanying Helmut Kohl when he came to see Prime Minister Mazowiecki. And of course, we realized then that this was a revolution. And luckily, it has turned out to be a positive revolution for the whole of Europe. And you have to go back probably 220 years to find a time in European history when Poland has had such a pivotal, a strong position, politically, economically, sociologically. And I think that does indeed bear witness to the great fortitude of the Polish people. This needs to be said here now as we start our 2-hour session. Because where there have been challenges, the Poles have withstood them. Where there have been tragedies, the Poles have borne them. And we think of the terrible plane crash only last year, which deprived Poland of so many of its leading personalities. And where there have been triumphs, the Poles have celebrated them with dignity, with courage, and with that moral will that the President of the European Parliament has just spoken about. We're here to discuss the global nature of this crisis. And this has been said already by several of the speakers. To my mind, this reminds me of a Grimm's fairy story. And I'm sure this is well understood also in the Polish language. You know the story of the small boy in the village who discovers the magic secret to open up the pot of porridge. And all the people in the village, including his own mother in the house where he lives, are very poor. They're destitute. This is sometime during the 30 Years' War. So the porridge boils, and all in the house are satisfied. The porridge boils over. The street is full of porridge. It boils over further. The village, and then the forest. And then the whole world is full of porridge. The pot keeps boiling because the small boy, he knew the magic formula to open the pot, but he didn't know the magic formula to put the lid back onto the pot. And it seems to me that we are in a similar position in the euro area, because as we have said, a project which started out as a cause for stability and hope in Europe has turned out now, whether rightly or wrongly, to be something which is blamed for instability, not just in Europe, but on a wider scale. As Marek Belka said, the euro is less attractive now for the countries that are outside, and the cost of capital within the euro has arguably risen. Nonetheless, many countries remain strongly committed, as the President of the National Bank has said, to join. We British, of course, remain strongly committed to not being committed. But there's one thing we are committed to, and that is to the title of this conference, a stable and integrated Europe, in which Britain plays still, despite everything, an extremely important part. So to open up the conference, I'm going to introduce each of our guests in turn. And I'm going to ask them to speak for maybe between 7 to 10 minutes to open up our 2-hour session. I'm going to try to divide the session, if I can, into where we've come from, where we are now, and where we're going. And I'm going to ask Daniel Gros, who has a very distinguished career at the International Monetary Fund and in the European Commission. He's now director, and he has been for a decade, the Centre for European Policy Studies in Brussels, one of the foremost European think tanks. to say a few words to open us up. And I believe, Daniel, I read from the CV that you are also a member of the supervisory board of the Icelandic Central Bank, but only since 2009, when everything started to go well. Some of you may have slides, some of you may not. You're welcome if you wish to go to the podium. I would prefer, as a chairman, if you remained seated, because it's more informal and I can possibly keep you under better control. But Daniel, the floor is yours now for 7 to 10 minutes to say a little bit about the antecedents to where we are and possibly guide us towards a more integrated and stable Europe.
Thank you very much, David, for this introduction, and many thanks to the organizers for being able to participate in this event. 8 minutes for where we come from, where we go, and the solution. That's difficult. Perhaps after hearing the introduction earlier this morning, I will spend a bit more time on where we come from. I think that's very important, and maybe in the second round we can discuss more of the solutions. So I will basically try to go just to the first 2 points which I have here on this introduction. I think one has to keep in mind the background for our present situation here and the fundamental flaws in the EU-EMU system. And that is, by the way, why in my presentation I had, after submittation, put a question mark, because I have the impression that right now, perhaps because of our integration, we have a more dangerous of stability within the euro area. And I'll try to illustrate that later with a few numbers also. Okay, background and the lessons from history. I speak here under the control of Jacob Frenkel, my teacher, who knows much more about these things. But let me just say, in general, what I find really important to keep in mind is that we have had a global credit boom leading to excess leverage on both sides of the Atlantic. And I repeat that, it's very important to understand, especially in light of what President Trichet said earlier this morning, where he said that after all, the euro area has a better fiscal policy, at least has lower deficit than the United States. But I wanted to convince you that that might be true, but there's other elements on our side of the Atlantic which are weaker, and that's leverage. That is the accumulation of debt, especially in the financial system, which has grown more in the euro area and which has not come down so far. And the lessons from history, now very briefly summarized, is that when you have a period of deleverage, it takes time, it is enormously costly in terms of growth, and it usually leads to a wave of bankruptcies, both sovereigns and banks. And the question is, of course, whether we can minimize these fallouts for our part of the world. Now, the first part on where the crisis comes from, it's always said and repeated, this was a crisis in the US housing market because of subprime lending. If you look at the numbers, you see quite clearly that the increase in house prices has been about the same in the US and in the euro area. Here on this chart, maybe it's too far away to see the details, but you see roughly two lines which have a similar increase before the crisis. That the red line is the US, the blue line is the euro area. And then you also see, and that's very important to keep in mind, that the adjustment in the US is much more quickly. House prices have fallen already considerably in the US, whereas they have fallen relatively little in the euro area, which tells us already, first thing, in the US, the problem might be, or the situation might be normalizing. We are probably far away from it. And the second point is even more important for me, and that is that if you look at the amount of credit created in the economy, relative to the economy, you see actually that if you compare 1999 to 2007, the initial level and the final level were almost exactly the same in the euro area and in the US. So there has been almost exactly the same credit expansion relative to GDP in the two areas up to before the crisis. Right? So I think we should really be very careful saying this is a US crisis. This accumulation of credit, by the way, happened under the watchful eye of the Federal Reserve and the ECB. I think the Federal Reserve applauded it, right? Financial markets getting more efficient and so on. And the ECB didn't quite applaud it, but both let it happen. Now, what I find particularly striking is that after the crisis, since 2007, actually the leverage trend has remained intact in the euro area. It actually increased, whereas in the US it has broadly stabilized. And that's very important to keep in mind. That is why we have now a particularly euro area problem. It is not just the fiscal policy, it is the overall amount of leverage. Now, just one technical point here. If you look at these numbers in the white squares, you see that what has happened in the euro area is particularly that financial corporations have increased their leverage. Increased. I thought the point after all the reforms we had after the recession was that that should decrease. If you go down the same figures for the US, you see that financial corporations in the United States have decreased their leverage. In Europe, it has increased. And therefore, I think no wonder that we face right now a combined sovereign and banking crisis. So that's general background. Keep that in mind. The second key point is that we had from the start an inconsistency in EMU. Basically, we had on the one hand the Maastricht Treaty, which said no bailout, which logically includes there could be a state insolvency. And secondly, and that is very little discussed, our regulatory system assumes that government bonds are riskless. Banks have to hold zero capital. The case of Dexia, for example, which was recently through the press, is very indicative in this respect. Dexia had a balance sheet of 400 billion and equity of, I don't know, less than 8 or 10. So overall, a huge leverage, but the risk-weighted assets of Dexia were very small. So for the regulators, Dexia had a risk-weighted capital ratio of 12%. Solid bank, right? Of course, what does a risk-weighted measure mean if the risk you assign to government credit is zero? And the second point that is often overlooked, perhaps even more important, that is that there's no exposure limit to a single name. Normally, a bank can lend only 1/4 of its capital to any single name, any single economic entity. But it can lend 4 times its capital to one country, to one government. And when that happens, of course, if the government gets into problems, the bank is bankrupt. We see that in the case of Greece right now. Imagine the Greek banks, if they had to hold bonds from average of the euro area, bonds, French bonds, Italian and so on, then there would be very little need to recapitalize them. And these are two very small, if you want, regulatory items, but they show to what extent our regulatory system was based on the assumption sovereign credit is riskless. The same holds, by the way, for insurance companies, but that's just another aspect of the same facet. And now, of course, we are in a situation where we know that sovereign credit is no longer 100% certain. Right? And what happens? Of course, the entire edifice comes crumbling down or squeaking left and right, and the banks and the governments are tied together. Banks hold large amounts of government debt, insolvent government, insolvent banks, right? Or suspicion of insolvency. Yeah? That's Greece and Italy. And also without the banks, the economy goes bust. That's insolvent banks, insolvent government, that's Ireland or Spain, right? And when we come to the sovereign, again, we don't know what to do. That's the key problem in the euro area. We don't know what to do so far, and this is why we need to have a mechanism which can deal with state insolvency. Now, if I can make one second important point, which is on the potential dangers for sovereigns within the euro area. In a quote-unquote normal country, let's say like Poland, even if there's a high debt of the government, the financial markets know that even if they didn't want to renew any government debt as of today, the government would not become illiquid and insolvent because it has a central bank which would presumably stand behind it. In the euro area, that's different. Every country in the euro area is basically like an emerging market which has its own debt denominated in a foreign currency or rather in a currency which it cannot control. And that is why there's always a danger of a speculative attack happening within the euro area. And that means euro area countries are more vulnerable. Their ability to carry large debt levels is lower than, if you want, other countries. That was overlooked during the credit boom, now comes to the fore, and financial markets, as usual, do the opposite what they did beforehand. On top of that, a lot of the government debt is now held abroad. That's where we come to the aspect of integration. People thought it's very nice. German, French, and Spanish savers hold Italian bonds. Italian savers hold German, French bonds, risk distribution, better allocation of risk, very, very nice. Now what happens in a crisis, this very integration becomes a danger, because these foreign savers have a tendency in a crisis to very rapidly lose trust in a country. They hear vaguely, in Italy is something going wrong. Italy now becomes a risk factor. So in German pension funds, insurance companies, even the regulators, they hear exposure to Italy, risk, please reduce. There's no rational analysis of what are the risks, what are the returns. Just reduce it because we don't want to be caught with a large Italian exposure. Everybody wants to sell. There's no buyer. Of course, we have a financial crisis. So the very high level of integration which we have achieved in financial market in a crisis becomes a source of great instability. The only functioning institution at present which can actually intermediate international or cross-country capital flows within the euro area is, of course, then the ECB. So the ECB now has basically two burdens to carry at the same time. It has to deal with the liquidity support for governments, the potential for speculative attack, which I mentioned earlier, and it has to deal with the fact that right now cross-border lending has come to a halt. But if everybody wants to have his money back, then we have a bank run and all the banks come down. So that's why the balance sheet of the ECB now reflects all the capital flows which are not taking place any along private lines. And I think that's the challenge we're facing right now. We can discuss that later. How to handle this situation where financial markets have lost confidence in anything that is beyond the borders, and especially in some particular countries and banks. My idea, of course, that we need something like a European monetary fund, but maybe I will talk about that in detail later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was absolutely right to start us off. And we are like doctors here, like medical doctors, because we are now carrying out a diagnosis. And to carry on with the diagnosis, I'm going to ask Jacob Frenkel to go to the podium, because Jacob Frenkel is a born leader. He, as well as having a very important position now at JPMorgan Chase, he did used to be the governor of the Bank of Israel. As well as that, of course, you were the intellectual mentor of Daniel Gros and many others. And it says in your CV that you eradicated inflation in Israel. So this reminds me of Hjalmar Schacht, the great sorcerer and the magician of Germany in the 20s and the 30s, who did, of course, eradicate inflation in Germany. And, of course, I shall be talking about Hjalmar Schacht when we come on to Dr. Stark later on. So, Jacob, I believe you're also going to go further into the diagnosis and tell us about imbalances in Europe and how they came about. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a both delight and pleasure to be here today. And without repeating the words of Jean-Claude Trichet, I must say I have a very similar feeling. I started coming to Poland in the mid-80s. Actually lived here for a couple of months in late 89 during the time which the stabilization program was designed. I must say that anyone who participated in the ordinary experience ignored that we are in a different universe. The subject is the euro. And all the discussion Maybe I was overly complimenting. The subject is the euro, and anyone who reads the press today or listens to television has the impression that it all hinges on how much money will be put in the system. We need financing. We need financing. The reality is that those of us who remember the early debates when a country is in a crisis, always we need to ask, how did it come to the crisis? What adjustments are needed? And in order to facilitate the adjustments, time needs to be allowed for, and that's where the financing comes in. But the financing is not coming in order to solve a problem. The financing is coming in order to allow the time for the real adjustment to take place, so that in the morning after, once the financing is gone, the country can go again into the capital markets. It is sufficiently competitive, sufficiently flexible, and stands on its own feet. With this in mind, I must confess that much of the discussion, and those of us who were in Frankfurt 2 days ago witnessed it also, focuses on the financing, and maybe that's the right way. When you have a fire, you need to extinguish it, but we need to remember what happens to the world after the fire. But in order to find out what kind of world we want to have after the fire, we need to go back and say, how did the fire start in the first place? And that's why, in a very similar way to what Daniel Gros did, I would like to take you back a little bit to the world in general and ask what structure in the world facilitated, enabled, encouraged, and brought about this crisis. So I'll go very quickly over it and basically say we have been in a world in which there have been a lot of imbalances. And we will not go through all of these imbalances, but I can tell you one thing. If somebody from the planet Mars, not knowing anything about the current problems, if he just came down to Earth and asked, let me look at some statistics for the world. I don't know what Europe is about, but I will look about statistics about the world, and I will see that the industrial world, as we all know, went into a very deep recession or slowdown in 2008. It started to recover, everything looked okay, and then it came down again, but still, based on the forecasts of the IMF of last month, we are still growing at a very limited time, a limited period. I personally do not believe that the US is going into a double dip, but it's a very mediocre growth. And if it is mediocre growth, the question needs to be done, why do we have mediocre growth? We also have, of course, another part of the world, the developing countries, where the picture, if you don't have a magnifying glass, looks very similar. A dip in 2008, 9, and then recovery again. But we all know that the developing countries have been doing much better. Based on this, our friend from the planet Mars will not declare that we have a crisis. And that's a very important point, because one of the reasons why we have the crisis is that we were superficial in looking at those aggregates. The most important change that has taken place in our world in general between the two visits of our friend from the planet Mars, as you know, he's coming to our planet every 20 years. So when he was here in 1990, he saw that most of the output of the world came from the US and Europe. Europe was, at the time, 29% or so of world output. The US was about 25% of world output. Asia was a non-entity. In fact, China and India together produced just 7% of world output. This was the world. And now he comes again, and he sees that China and India alone produce already close to 17, maybe by now close to 20% of world output. Europe is producing a smaller fraction. US is producing a smaller fraction. We know that big change. And yet, As we go to Frankfurt 2 days ago, or as we go many places, and as we look at the composition of the board of the IMF, etc., we do not yet see these fundamental changes. We are playing chess with ourselves while much of the action is happening somewhere else. But, and this is a first point that our friend from Marsh notes, is we have had significant imbalances in the world, and those imbalances have not been episodic, but they were structural. And over the years, the US has overspent. It has had a big deficit. The reason why it was facilitated and the mechanism by which it was financed was the very large surplus in other parts of the world, which we know. It's Asia, it's the oil exporters, etc. So far so good, except that when you have large deficits, you accumulate debt. And when you accumulate debt, you become vulnerable. And when you become vulnerable, occasionally the economic news move from the back pages to the front page because they become political news. But against this background, as we look at the European imbalance, current account imbalance, and this has been hailed for a long period as a success, the argument was, it's not us. We are, on the whole, relatively balanced. Our deficit is small, our surplus if it is small, and this was the background. And therefore, with all the extraordinary euphoria of the creation of the fantastic vision of the European dream, we did not realize, or those who looked at it did not realize, that underneath that aggregate there is a very important potential crisis. And this brings me, therefore, to the European system. Because up to now, our friend from Mars will say, what's the big deal? Remember, while Poland was struggling in the first years after the stabilization that started in January 1, 1990, and in the first few years Poland was struggling to solidify this extraordinary success, the Europeans have been busy in building the dream. And in fact, they had it right, and they realized that if you give up exchange rates, and if you give up monetary policy, because you are all delegating it to the single currency and to the ECB, then you better make sure that your interests are aligned so that the fiscal policy is also aligned. So the principle of the Maastricht Treaty was very, very sensible, but it was a treaty without teeth. And indeed, immediately after the introduction of the Maastricht Treaty, the two largest countries, Germany and France, almost as a strategy, decided to renege on it, and almost as a strategy, decided that it was not very important. And the Maastricht Treaty became a treaty that was called the Stability Pact, while we have to remember that it was originated as the Growth and Stability Pact, but still the measures were not consistent with it. And the question was, having had a full decade to bring about convergence up to the introduction of the euro at the late 1990s, the question was, have the rules of the game been adhered to? And again, my friend from Mars is asking, how come all of these countries belong to the same bed? Are they capable of staying in the same bed? If Spain has an unemployment rate of over 21%, and if Germany has unemployment rate less than 7%, and in between there is this big spread, are they belonging to the same bed? He went on and said, what happened to their competitiveness? If in 2001, unit labor cost was defined as an index of 100, look what happened to it within 1 decade. Within 1 decade, Italy's unit labor cost went up to more than 130 relatively to the 100, and in Germany it went down. And in between, there is the spectrum. So if the mix was right 10 years ago, obviously the mix is very bad a decade later. And this competitiveness difference has been at the root cause of a problem, because in the old days, we know what would have happened. You would have either gone to the IMF, asked for a program, you would have devalued your currency, you would have consolidated your budget and all the rest, but you don't have this luxury anymore. In fact, your fiscal position has been significantly challenged. The debt got accumulated in a very different degree, whereas at the beginning everyone was around the 60%, now everyone is above the 100%. The reliance on debt has varied across countries. Greece has become highly vulnerable because it financed its deficit through foreign debt. Germany has financed it through domestically. And the key point is that in the decades since the adoption of the euro, Portugal, Greece, Ireland have decided to raise their consumption to levels and lower their savings in a fundamental sense, whereas at the same time, Germany raised its savings. Do they belong to the same debt, to the same bed? And indeed, whereas the overall current account of Europe was relatively balanced, we had a fundamental imbalance within Europe. Germany running a surplus of about 5%, and the periphery countries running about deficits of about 5%. And so far, if it is going on, then one part of the world accumulates debt, the other one accumulates assets, except for the fact that there is a morning after. And if your economic base is not clearly demonstrating that you have the capacity to service the debt and to return the principal, one day the markets wake up and they say, wow. And at that point, when the market wake up and say, wow, there is no big difference between private debt and sovereign debt, because when the private debt, they go down, the banks go down, the government takes over, and it becomes sovereign debt. And the markets indeed recognized it and priced it. And that's an important point that I want to make. One of the victims, at least in North America, of the crisis of 2008 is that it became popular to say markets have failed, market information is irrelevant, we cannot rely on or even be concerned by market information, we, the bureaucrats, therefore, are more capable of running the business. But the markets were very loud and clear. They say Greek debt, Irish debt, Portuguese debt, Spanish debt to a lesser extent is not like German debt. But if that's the case, then we realize what happened. The euro system, in its introduction, eliminated a very important element of risk, currency risk. It did not eliminate credit risk. And if you do not eliminate credit risk because each country is a different credit worthiness by its own behavior, and I say country because, as I said, whether it is banks or non-banks, at the end of the day, it's the country, then you raise the question of is the infrastructure in place for a European, pan-European bond? We probably need to have a system that has a pan-European bond because it's a logical corollary to a system that has a single currency. But in order to have the pan-European bond, it's not a matter of a legal decision, it's a matter of a market that generates rationality to have such a bond. At the present time, it does not exist.
Jacob, I don't want to interrupt you when you are in such magnificent full flow.
And as a result, I will stop here and only say, thank you very much for telling me. It was not unintentional that I stood with my back to the chairman. Sorry. I hope, Mr. Chairman, that you will ask me later on to say something about the very long term, the demographic trends, and what do they imply for the European vision at large, and does Europe become less and less significant in the growing world, no matter what happens to the family quarrels? Because Europe, the fact is aging and shrinking relatively to the world. And it does not mean that therefore you should raise your hands in despair, but on the other hand, it's an agenda for economic and political program, and I will be happy to elaborate a little later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I shall indeed allow you time if you allow yourself time, but that was a magnificent piece of oratory. And I think we did see the old magic of Jacob Frenkel there, bestriding the stage like a colossus. So thank you very much indeed. And we are now going to advance further along the diagnostic path. We've had several very interesting comments, the amount of leverage under the watchful eye of the European Central Bank, small amount of almost Polish-type gallows humor there, Jürgen. We heard also from Jacob now the build-up of what he termed foreign currency debt. And of course, that is really quite interesting that we see the euro as a foreign currency in some ways for its own members. It's a domestic currency when everything goes well, and then it becomes a foreign currency when things go wrong. Further along the diagnostic track, Thomas Meyer, but also a man of solutions, because Thomas, he's the third member of our panel to have worked for the International Monetary Fund, so he has a very good grounding, but he's worked now for the Deutsche Bank for 10 years. And of course, as well as telling us a little bit about the diagnosis and where we came from, I feel sure you'll tell us something about the solution, because you are one of the people who has suggested a new form of European government borrowing of a collective nature, and you've also taken up the idea, given great currency now, together with Allianz, of the insurance-type solution. So we're looking forward to hearing from you now, Thomas, your view of the situation in Europe.
Thank you, David. I'd like to actually look a little bit beyond these presently discussed proposals. When you here look at this first slide, you will notice that for some mysterious reasons, we like to put our logo on top of a Swiss mountain. If I had been able to design this template for this conference, I would probably have shown an iceberg. And on the top of the iceberg, above the waterline, I would have put public debt crisis and banking crisis. And below the waterline, I would have put balance of payments crisis. I think we are presently dealing with the first two, and I think the part of the iceberg below the waterline is slowly growing on us.
I was just going to say, Thomas, in the world of the Deutsche Bank, there doesn't seem to be global warming.
No, it doesn't. We're actively helping the world to stay cool.
This is short-term oriented.
Of course, here you see something that you have seen already in Jacob's slides, and I think Daniel alluded to it. We had, of course, the first 10 years of the euro were warmed by the sun of easy credit, and we had the GIIPS countries.
Can everybody hear, ladies and gentlemen? Can you hear at the back?
Can you hear that?
Yes, you're fine.
Okay, I can. Very well. So we had the GIIPS countries here embark upon a credit-driven expansion, while Germany, that didn't benefit from this wonderfully low interest rate, cheap credit, was lagging behind. Some of you will remember the time when Germany was called the sick man of Europe. And as the party was getting really married, GIIPS lost a bit of cost control. They overborrowed, they overspent, they overstimulated, while Germany was working down its cost. And of course, the result is well known. You saw this already also in Jacob's slides. We got large internal current account imbalances in EMU. And I remember a time when leading ECB policymakers were saying, why worry about this? This is like a current account position between Texas and California, so who worries about that? Why should we worry about the euro area current account imbalances? Well, we are not in the United States of Europe. We are a union of sovereign nation states, and we have built it accordingly, i.e. there are still countries with actually national central banks that have then banded together under the umbrella of the ECB. So we have still national central banks. We have national banking sectors. And we, of course, then need, as countries, when we have such current account deficits, we need to attract private sector capital flows, or we have a problem. So the euro area, I think, is better to compare to a fixed exchange rate system, very, very fixed exchange rate system out of which you cannot easily escape, if at all. It's better to compare it to that than to the United States of America. So what happens if after a period of easy credit, you have borrowed a lot, you have lost control over your costs, you are over-indebted privately and publicly, and all of a sudden you experience what in the emerging market literature has become known as a sudden stop. Well, in this case, in a fixed exchange rate arrangement, the central bank begins to lose its reserves, right? And when the reserves are over and done with, then basically the exchange rate system breaks apart. In the process, of course, you're experiencing, as the central bank will fight, as you want to adjust your real exchange rate down, you of course experience a period of great stress. You have defaults in the private sector as you try to manage down your real exchange rate. You may even have defaults in parts of the public sector. So we are basically in a situation where we are trying to manage down the overvalued real internal exchange rate of the South, so GIIPS, right, relative to the North. We try to manage it down to realign these internal real exchange rates. And since we cannot adjust the nominal exchange rate, we try to manage this down. And in the process, we, of course, as has been said by the previous speakers, we, of course, encounter public sector debt crisis, and we then encounter banking crisis. But does the adjustment really work like that? Well, not really, because there is a safety valve. The safety valve is called the euro system. So if we have, even after working hard on these problems, if we still have current account deficits and we have capital account deficits because capital flees out of the deflationary parts of the euro area, we have a balance of payments deficit that the euro system conveniently automatically funds. So a mechanism called Target 2. It's an interbank payment system that sets in and funnels ECB money to the countries that need it most. This is just a slide that shows you the geographical composition or distribution of ECB refunding operations. And all you need to do is here watch the orange or yellowish line, which is plotted on the right-hand side. This tells you the share of ECB refis going to Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. And as you can see, this increased from a little less than 20%. That's even slightly less than the share of these countries in GDP in 2007 to now between 70 and 80%. So the ECB's refis are really reaching here an area, 3/4 of the ECB's refis are reaching an area that is about a third of the total GDP. The system works such that over target, if you have a balance of payments deficit, you basically get funded by the central banks that have a balance of payments surplus. It's an automatic equalization, automatic balance of payments imbalance mechanism that brings you back to an overall zero system. So this means basically that over time, the Bundesbank within Target 2 has accumulated claims on the euro system, on the ECB, which is in the middle of now arranging this balance of payments funding of 440 billion euros. That is the state of August, September. And as you can see, as the funding of the current account surplus of Germany with capital outflows began to dry up as suspicion set in about the southern European countries and Ireland. You can see how then the Euro system balance of payments funding kicked in, and the balanced balance of payments that Germany had between 2003 and 2007 that I show in this slide became unbalanced. Now, of course, the counterpart of this Bundesbank balance of payments funding are those countries that are receiving balance of payments support. Here I have it's an electronic problem. I don't know, maybe it tells me something, but the Italian 103.5, whenever I do it in PowerPoint, I see the minus, and when it's turned into PDF, the minus disappears, so the Italian will not stick. But I can assure you...
Many congratulations, Thomas, you've just solved the crisis.
It's the software that refuses actually to put the minus onto Italy, but I can assure you, check the numbers, it's a minus. So they've tried it to bring it on the PDF, and it doesn't work. So now what you see here is that these cumulated balance of payments deficits have led to a situation where the North actually has given balance of payments support to the South and Ireland in an accumulated amount of 630 billion euros. That's the situation of August, September. This is basically balance of payments funding totally below the line. These are resource transfers that have occurred without any politician, any parliament noticing it. Yeah? You could have put it above the line of the balance of payments, then it would have shown up as credit that would have had to go through parliaments, or as transfers that would have had to go through parliament. The parliaments are stingy, they don't want to do it, right? They keep their purse, but the Euro system does it for them below the line. So it is a bypass, a wonderful bypass to actually keep the system afloat while policymakers have great difficulties in appropriating the money above the line. So what do we do with this problem, as it is not disappearing? In fact, unfortunately, the Italian situation was actually plus 3.5 at the end of 2010 and is now turning minus 103.5 by August, September. France, in fact, is slightly sort of turning yellowish and towards reddish. That was at the end of 2010 also much better. And the Germans have already, as you could see from the previous chart, accumulated about 100 billion plus in the first 8 months of this year. So what do you do? It's basically grows and grows and grows on you. Well, I think a permanent resource transfer below the line through the balance of payments support through the Euro system is not going to be sustainable, because I think these slides that we are watching here at some stage will probably surface. And some of the MPs in the parliament will ask, what's going on here? So I don't think that we can just keep on doing that. When it surfaces, of course, we can decide we put it above the line. And I think Jacob suggested that we do Eurobonds, which would be basically that. Now we own up to the system. We put it above the line. Well, if you follow the discussion in Germany, this is going to be very, very difficult. If you follow the discussion in Holland and in Finland, it's not going to happen. We're not going to put this above the line, this thing. So what do we do next? Well, of course, as we know from fixed exchange rate economics, when we have such a situation, we don't want to give up our exchange rate, we have run out of reserves. Well, we deflate really hard. So we reduce in the South the prices of goods, of services and assets, much more so than we have seen so far. What does that imply? More bankruptcies in the private sector, more bankruptcies in the public sector, and probably severe social unrest. So Greece, in this regard, is just a foreshadowing what we're going to see if we seriously want to realign the internal exchange rates through the deflation in the South. Well, the other option, of course, is to inflate the North. And that's probably in the near term the less painful option. And it's probably the option that is also feasible, because structurally speaking, the South has a majority in the ECB Council. So they can always outvote the North. So you inflate the North. That's also a possibility to adjust the internal exchange rate. So this means that we're getting rising goods prices, rising services pricing, and rising asset prices in the north. For a while, this will feel great. So that will assure us probably stability in EMU for the next 3, 4, 5 years. But when the north sort of realizes it, actually, is that the European Monetary Union that we wanted? Was that intended? 1.95% during the first average inflation during the first 10 years of EMU. Well, what about if the next 10 years are 4.55 or 6.55 or whatever? Well, the North probably wouldn't like that either. So what?
Thomas, I'm going to ask you to stop on that note,
stop on
if
that
I may.
because I want just offer my conclusion of that, what we get. Probably
You don't want to keep us in suspense until later on.
Well, you want me to say the
Why
conclusion?
don't you keep us in suspense? Because
Keep
the
in
art of a
suspense,
chairman is always to keep the suspense going. Yes, thank you. And that has, in fact, been a very good build-up to Jürgen Stark. Jürgen Stark is a very senior central banker. He has been also a state secretary at the Ministry of Finance. He was the Sherpa to Chancellor Kohl during the 1990s. He also developed, with Chancellor Kohl and Theo Weigel, the finance minister, the Stability Pact, which only later became the Stability and Growth Pact. And that was in 1995. And of course, as is well known, various chancellors and prime ministers and presidents decided that it wasn't a very good thing. And Chancellor Schröder, he didn't say he changed the pact, he simply said he politicized it. So you know a lot about things that have gone on in Europe, Jürgen. I'm very disappointed to say that you announced your resignation only about a month or so ago, which was a great shock to us all. And I thought that it was indeed one of the most important German central bankers to have resigned since Hjalmar Schacht in 1939. I'm very disappointed, and I'm sure you're going to tell us in your own words why that is the case. There is, as you know, in the Irish literature, Oscar Wilde. I believe that the resignation of Jürgen Stark was even more significant than that of Axel Weber earlier in the year. But Oscar Wilde did write in The Importance of Being Earnest, and I'm only slightly changing the words. To lose one Bundesbanker may appear like misfortune. To lose two starts to look like carelessness. So you can tell us all about that, but tell us about the Stability and Growth Pact as well, and tell us also about the financial channel which the ECB has developed in a wonderful, grandiose way. And also inflation. You are maybe leaving at the high point, i.e. the low point of inflation, according to Thomas Meyer. So try to fill in some of the gaps in the story, if you wouldn't mind, in 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, David. First of all, I would like to thank the National Bank of Poland for having invited me to participate in this conference with a very interesting and timely theme, so towards a more integrated and stable Europe. When I accepted this invitation, I was not fully aware that this panel was chaired by David Marsh. It is always dangerous to have him as a moderator in a panel, and his brief introduction is evident that it is dangerous. So I will not comment in more detail. So I have to disappoint you, ladies and gentlemen. I have no slides, no PowerPoint, but I hope that my remarks will be neither powerless nor pointless.
You are an old-fashioned central banker,
yeah. So
Jürgen,
there
and we
is
salute that.
a lot of issues which I would like to comment from what the previous speakers said. Only two remarks in this context. What Jacob Frenkel said about financing, I totally agree. The financing. What is provided is just to buy time. But to buy time to what end? This is the key. And with ever larger rescue packages, this is my personal point of view, ever larger rescue packages, in the end, I agree with Jacob, there is a risk that in the end the water damage is much more significant, much larger than the damage done by the fire. So it has to be well designed, and the key issue is the adjustment during this period in which a country is taken off the market, so that the adjustment really takes place. The second point, and this is in my mind, so a bit a dilemma of the economist's profession, that with the benefit of hindsight, we realized that there was a problem. When we talk about the current account imbalances within the euro area, as it has been shown by Jacob, the current account is balanced, broadly balanced in Europe, but we have significant imbalances within the euro area. And the institution I represent here was the only one who raised this issue already many years ago. It started in 2005, 2006. We know that current account imbalances don't emerge overnight. It is a longer-term process. And we addressed this issue vis-à-vis politicians already in 2005, 2006. But there was no urgency. It was not seen as an emergency case at one point in time, so no policy reaction followed. And to put this in the context of the single monetary union, or single monetary policy with a common currency, based under the headline of one size fits all, my predecessor in this position said, and I totally agree, one size must fit all. What does it mean, one size must fit all? It means that it is the central bank, which has a clear mandate, has to fulfill its mandate, and this mandate says to deliver price stability in the medium term. And that's what we have done, as our president said this morning. But what is needed is adjustment at the national level, the adjustment to the conditions of a monetary union. And this is exactly what has not happened. And we are still blamed, the ECB is still blamed in at least one country, which is under an EU IMF program, that the monetary policy was too lax for this particular country. First, that the ECB did not warn politicians in their respective country about the longer-term impact of relatively low interest rates, and that the ECB has failed in supervising the banking system in the respective country. So we are in charge of monetary policy. We set a single rate for short-term interest rates. Second, there were warnings, but maybe politicians heard but did not listen. And third, we are not in charge of neither in regulation or supervision. Now, it takes a bit longer than 10 minutes, David, so give me please 2 minutes more. Where do we come from, where are we, and where do we go? Let me say that I personally, I'm in this business of European integration for more than 20 years, in different capacities, as David Marsh said. And let me stress what also was said at the inaugural part of this conference. We have achieved a lot, and we should not allow that what we have achieved at 27, but also at 17, that this is put at risk. So we have to do all we can. We do what we can at the side of the ECB to tackle the crisis as far as our mandate is concerned. And some are of the view that we have already gone a bit beyond the mandate, so that at least at the, close to the red line. But on the other hand, what is still lacking is first, political leadership in Europe, and second, based on this, political decisions in order to restore confidence. Because what we are facing in Europe is not only a sovereign debt crisis, it's particular confidence crisis, and confidence has to be restored. And this only can be done at the level of politicians. So let me say we have achieved a lot with a single market, with a common currency, and this process over the last 60 years always was characterized by crisis, by setbacks, and it always has been overcome. And with a next step in integration, and this is exactly what we need. We need, I would not call it a vision, but a clear view of the way forward with a deepening of the integration of Europe. And here it comes very quickly to the issue of the multi-speed integration or to move ahead at all. It is a matter of fact. I understand this political argument, not to make a distinction between the euro area on the one hand and the other member states on the other hand, but it is simply a matter of fact. It's a fact of life that we have a multi-speed integration process. This is perceived to be only temporary, but it can last. So I think we have to be aware of this. From my point of view, being, as I said, in this business for more than 20 years in different capacities, the fundamental logic of the Maastricht Treaty is still valid. It's still correct. And nobody should put in question what was achieved in Maastricht as the foundations for monetary union. And this has to do with the prohibition of monetary financing of governments, the prohibition of privileged access to financial institutions by public sector. The no bailout principle is still an issue I would like to stress, and to avoid excessive deficits. Not to forget the eligibility for membership of the euro area was tied and is tied to convergence criteria. And maybe also in this respect, a mistake was made in the past, that these convergence criteria were interpreted in a laxist way, in a very laxist way, based on unreliable statistics. So, and I think this is also a field where progress has to be made. And not to forget the stability and growth pact. I come back to this in a second. So in my
sorry,
view,
Jürgen, you don't have too many seconds left.
Yeah, okay, we will see, maybe. For me, the revival of the Maastricht spirit is key as a basis for the next steps of integration. And we have seen next step of integration with the enhancement of economic governance, the enhancement of the Stability and Growth Pact, and with a new process, a new procedure, which is macroeconomic surveillance, in order to address the internal imbalances in the euro area. Exactly, this is the point. To avoid the emergence of current account imbalances, to detect this development already at an early stage, so to allow for a correction. So we have these significant internal and external imbalances within the euro area, and here we have a failure of policy making at the national level and at the supranational level. At the national level, with the wage and income policies, they're not geared towards the preserving competitiveness, as it was pointed out by Jacob, in a monetary union, the failure to address the structural rigidities, and as I said already at the start, the laxist interpretation of convergence criteria. Now on the Stability and Growth Pact, which only clarified what is already in the Maastricht Treaty. And here we have, with these rules on the fiscal rules, but also the economic policy guidelines to coordinate economic policies were either not respected or watered down. Let me say they were simply ignored, or in the year 2005, the Stability and Growth Pact was reformed. And symptomatic for this reform was the term used in the context of the reform process, namely to replace the peer pressure by peer support. This is really telling, and seeing Mario Monti here in front of me, I will say I absolutely agree with you. Your excellent term you used recently in a piece in the Financial Times about the problem we are facing in Europe with unhealthy politeness. And exactly this is where we are in. We have to be clearer. So way forward, we have the six-pack, which in our view is not going far enough. It is a basis for further improvement, in particular on the fiscal side. And from my point of view, what we need is a next step, an important step towards political union, which I mean fiscal union, But it cannot stop with the fiscal union. We have also to go further and to create a financial union. So in particular, the deal with the banking sector, cross-border banking, an important point with the single supervisor, regulator at the European level. And as far as the fiscal rules are concerned, so this is, I wrote with a few colleagues at the ECB interesting occasional paper in which we propose the creation of a European budget office as the nucleus for a European finance minister. And I think this should be something which really politicians should consider and to allow for a quantum leap in European integration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. You will, of course, have... you will, of course, have more time for occasional papers in the future, and we look forward to reading them. The discipline seems to be somehow losing effect as we go from the core to the periphery, but we are now going to have Jean Pisani-Ferry, who will be rounding off this first round. Just before you do that, if I may, I just want to ask you a very simple question, Jürgen, which won't eat further into the time, because it's a kind of linear question. I think it's very disturbing that, according to the opinion polls, something like 2/3 of German people no longer have confidence, they say, in the currency. With your resignation, did you, and you can answer one of 4 answers here, did you think that this would have no effect on that score? Did you think it might improve the score of confidence? Did you think the score might go down, or do you simply not know?
The simplest answer would be I don't know, but it's more complex. Asking the Germans about their opinion, their trust, and the confidence in the currency, it always depends on the question you raise, how the issue is addressed. You know this from your former capacity, how you draft the question, and the question will already influence the answer. What is key for us as a central bank? Yes, we have to get the confidence of the general public. And we have to communicate better what our president said this morning, what we have achieved over the last 12, 13 years, as long as the ECB has been in charge of monetary policy. But what is absolutely key and an important measure for confidence in a central bank is inflation expectations.
I think we're going to see more of you also in the future, Jürgen. I feel sure there's a Stark Commission or something like that coming on. Daniel, you'd like to just come in briefly on that point.
Yeah, there's a widespread impression created by one opinion poll in Germany. The Germans distrust the euro. Actually, there's a long time series by the Eurobarometer, which asks, as Jürgen said, a slightly different question, which is, do you support the euro as a common currency? And that support in Germany has been positive and constant for the last 5 years and has not gone down. So it's simply not true that the Germans have lost trust in the euro.
Good, thank you for that clarification. Now, Jean, you can obviously talk about the diagnostics, but I think we are now moving towards the original panel on which you were going to speak, which is the future. And Jean Pisani-Ferry, the director of Bruegel, again with Daniel, one of the most foremost European think tanks, and very, very good work in all these fields. Can you tell us a little bit about the future?
Thank you, David. I have to start by expressing a disappointment. When I learned that the other panelists on my panel about the future had dropped out, I thought it was a wonderful opportunity for Europe to speak with one voice. But this opportunity was again missed. So I'm on this panel, and I would wish to concentrate on 3 issues which have been addressed in part. I would wish to go back to them. One is the adjustment. One is the fragility with the sovereign debt. And one is the relationship between euro area and the rest of the EU. On the adjustment, I think what we are clearly seeing is a quantity adjustment. We've seen balance of payment imbalances being reduced. But if you look at the prices, you don't see a price adjustment taking place. So essentially what's going on is that deficit countries are adjusting by having higher unemployment rates and recessions. Whether or not this price adjustment is going to take place is crucial for the viability of the euro area. And the question is, what can be done for that? One thing to do, certainly in the program countries, is to have the right balance, to achieve the right balance between the focus on fiscal issues and the focus on structural issues. There is only a certain amount of political capital that governments can spend on fiscal adjustment and reforms. And the program has to be designed so that they spend the right proportion on fiscal and reforms. And I think that's one of the key reasons why the Greek program has to be revisited, and why this issue of the Greek debt is so important, because there is a fiscal bias that is too strong now. Obviously, that's only valid for program countries. More broadly, what can be done? Thomas Meyer spoke about inflation and relative price adjustment, and said higher inflation in the north is likely but dangerous. I think that the rules of the game are very clear. The ECB has a 2% inflation target. If relative prices have to change within the euro area, and they do have to change, this means higher inflation in Northern European countries and lower inflation in Southern European countries with respect to the 2% average. The ECB sticks to the average, and within this framework, the price adjustment takes place by relative inflation. That's just the opposite of what we've seen over the first 10 years, 12 years of EMU. Now, this has to be told at some point to public opinion in the north, that price stability in the euro area means that their inflation is going to be above 2% and probably closer to 3%, and that is highly desirable in the name of price stability in the euro area as a whole. The third thing that can be done in this respect is to foster adjustments with the instruments, the very imperfect instruments there are, be it for governments or for the EU. The internal devaluation has to be fostered through tax instruments when possible, and through more hands-on policies that the policies that have been implemented this far. I mean, it's certainly very good to emphasize structural reforms, and structural reforms do contribute to making this adjustment happen, but they may not be sufficient. And I think the EU should also consider whether structural funds can be used in better ways in countries that benefit from important flows at the service of directing resources to the traded goods sector, and also in terms of fostering price adjustment. And we may wish to go back to that. On the sovereign debt issue, well, what we have learned is that, and that was very much indicated in the presentation by Daniel and by Thomas, is that if there is no lender of last resort, the situation, the fragility of the euro area is more important than previously thought. And for the longer term, the question is, what is the right response to that? And I think there are basically three types of responses. One is to say, we need to draw all the lessons for government debt and to achieve levels of government debt that are super safe. And super safe means probably lower debt ratio than envisaged in the Maastricht Treaty with a 60% ratio. That may mean much less. In fact, if you look at the situation of Ireland and Spain, they had respectively 25% and 40% debt to GDP ratio. So, by the way, I think when we speak about the enforcement problem of the Stability and Growth Pact, this is absolutely right, but we should never forget about the design problems of the Stability and Growth Pact. The implicit liabilities and the potential cost of having a highly developed financial system were simply ignored in the Stability and Growth Pact, and that's what those countries paid for. Now, the question, if we think that you have to go from debt that's 120% of GDP in the case of Italy to something like perhaps 40 or even below, Carlo Cottarelli is here, has done all the math, and what it implies is frightening in terms of the adjustment it requires, the length of the adjustment, the level of primary surpluses that would correspond to that. So if we really want to go this way, we have to be sure that countries in the euro area will be able, for perhaps 2 decades, to undergo the fiscal adjustment that is required. The second answer is to say, let's have super safe financial systems. So state may default, but let's protect the financial system from the sovereign risk. And that means more capital, that means more diversification, that means a financial union that would cut this perverse link between sovereigns and banks. The question here is, first, is the political economy really with us? I mean, are we sure that governments, at a time when they have borrowed so much and they will be borrowing so much in the coming years, will accept losing privileged access to their own banking system? Do they really, are they really willing to go along this way? Carmen Reinhardt says exactly the opposite. Carmen Reinhardt says the behavior in times of high debt is financial repression. So, Italy keeping Italian savings to finance Italian deficits. We can't ignore this political economy.
Jean, I'm going to, I'm afraid, for the second time, bring down the guillotine and bring you and Thomas into a state of coitus interruptus. But in the knowledge, so that you will get your chance to speak again.
I was given 10 minutes, and my watch said...
It seems to have flown by, I have to say.
No, not entirely.
I'm very sorry, but I would like also to open up the conversation to the audience at some stage.
Let me say...
Okay, you're allowed to finish. Okay. Even a man at a guillotine can say his famous last words.
I will. Let me, on this super safe financial system solution, the other limit is that the US case in which states may fail without jeopardizing financial stability is a situation where the total debt of all states in the US is 20% of GDP, which is exactly the proportion of Italian debt with respect to EU GDP. So a single country is as much as all states in the US. Finally, fiscal union. That means a change in the rules of the game, a quite fundamental one. It means that there will be some control over fiscal behavior, and a change from an ex-post control with sanctions to some sort of ex-ante control as a quid pro quo for some sort of guarantee, Eurobonds or whatever. The one thing I would like to emphasize in concluding is that this cannot be done by a committee of technocrats. We are in democracies. There are 2 ways. One is a judicial way, to find a way to involve the European Court of Justice and to build a legal order in which the European Court of Justice can say your budget cannot be implemented, it's legally void. The other one is a parliamentary route in which a body, and that probably would have to be not only the European Parliament, which doesn't have taxing powers, but also combination of representation of national parliaments and the European Parliament would be able to overrule a parliament that would have voted a budget that is not in accordance with common principles. Let me stop here.
Well, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm conscious that there is quite a lot of consensus up here on the panel, because everybody seems to agree that certain mistakes were made in the past, and everybody agrees also that none of these gentlemen here were in any way responsible. Most of the gentlemen here, of course, saw this coming and have not been particularly surprised. So I'm now simply going to ask each one of them a very short question to go back into some detail into what they've said. And I would also like, maybe towards 12 o'clock, to open this up towards the audience, because I am conscious of the fact we are in Poland and that we had some very stirring statements earlier on about how there should not be a wall between the euro and other areas of Europe which are not presently in the euro area. So I would like one or two comments, please, from our Polish hosts and guests on that, maybe towards 12 o'clock, if I may. So, Daniel, if I may start with you, you produced these extraordinary, interesting charts showing how leverage had increased since the crisis in Europe. Of course, leverage could decrease as a result of some what is called haircuts. I really don't like that word haircuts, because the point is, if you go to the barber, you normally have to go again in 6 weeks. So I don't like the word haircuts. Write-downs. I mean, write-downs could be the future. Is that one way of getting rid of leverage?
Not enough. The write-downs, you can imagine, basically Greece. You wouldn't see it in the second figure after the comma. Actually, if I can say, in the US, the write-downs happen, but they happen of hundreds of thousands of different consumers, right? And without the system breaking down. In Europe, if we were to cut the biggies, Italy, then probably we can forget about our financial system for a while.
Thank you. Jacob, you are a banker. You spoke about how the market drove interest rates at the long end of the market also to what seemed like very comfortable levels. And Daniel also went into that. There was a certain contradiction, you might say, to the no bailout clause. Now the banks, the markets have driven the interest rates in the other direction. Is this the market getting out of hand, or is it simply the regulatory, sensible, corrective mechanism of the market? We heard from Jean-Claude Trichet as well that you need a crisis. And he said very interestingly this morning that Europe has somehow been protected from the ravages that the developing world, or Latin America, Asia, and so on, went in the 1980s and the 1990s. Almost as though you actually do need a good crisis from time to time to sort out the men from the boys. Is this crisis that we're in now, from a banking perspective, is this now sorting out which countries in Europe can really do the stuff, which are the ones which are fit to live in the 21st century, and which are the ones who are somehow going to go to the wayside? Is this almost like a Darwinian experiment that we're seeing now in Europe?
Well, I'm not sure I like so much the metaphors, because I think that we should be cognizant of the fact that it is the nature of creativity of human beings and of policymakers that will not eliminate crisis. We will have crisis. So the real challenge is not can we eliminate crisis or not, but rather are we going to be sufficiently resilient and robust to handle a crisis when it takes place. And I think that it is in this regard that I would view many of the proposals for reform of the international, of the financial sector, and I view them by and large very positively. The principle of having to have more capital, less leverage, and things of that type, more transparency, will create a better environment. And I think that, however, we will have more challenges. But I want to emphasize the issue of capital. It is always the case that, I think so, that at least the banking sector is stronger when it has more capital. That's almost a truism. The question is, from the economic system at large, whether the move from a situation in which you do not have enough capital to a situation in which you have what is believed to be the right capital, whether during that transition you are actually weakening the economic system. And that's where the supervision must be very, very, very strong. I will make one last point about this, even though it's not a subject of this conference. In the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, very quickly, all the calls all over were, how should we change the regulation? And I think that, as I said, many regulations had to be improved. But it is also the case that we need to ask, have the previous regulations been fully enforced? And there are a lot of evidence that actually had the existing regulation been fully enforced, many of the challenges that we face would not have been there. So I think we should really make sure that the enforcement of existing regulation is indeed watched for.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. Of course, we will be discussing the whole question of regulation this afternoon as the conference continues. Thomas, I did a terrible thing to you. I know I cut you off before your final PowerPoint slide. There's no worse fate than could befall the chief economist of the Deutsche Bank, so I do apologize for that. I'm sure there will be retribution next time you're chairing a panel that I'm on. But would you now like to continue and tell us, break the suspense and tell us the solution?
Well, David, there was no more PowerPoint slide. But
that is the solution.
Basically, this was the last PowerPoint slide. What I think what you'll get is basically a mixture of more transfers from the north to the south, some deflation in the south, and some inflation in the north, so that in the end, everyone feels just terribly miserable.
The question that you did put, will the North put up with higher inflation? I mean, the Germans will, won't they? The Germans are not going to walk away from this project. This idea that they could leave and go off into the sunlit uplands with the Dutch and the Austrians and the Finns, that's all just stuff for the teenage scribblers of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, isn't it?
It will be, I think, a long, drawn-out battle. Therefore, I couldn't agree more with the Chancellor Merkel when she said at the farewell of President Trichet on Wednesday that this summit that we have is just one further milestone on a long journey. And I think to wind down this balance of payments imbalances will be a very, very long journey, and it will basically, everyone will feel miserable by that. And there will be a struggle basically on the political side in the north, right, to make the south deflate, and the south will basically threaten the north with default so as to extract some concessions in terms of transfers and acceptance of higher inflation. So we'll have a continuous battle. Against that background, I think, we will re-emphasize, if you want, the EU, the European narrative. We need that, right, to survive this age of misery that the euro, I think, will be going through.
Thank you. I mean, all this makes us all feel very happy, us professional Euro watchers, because if the rest of the world is miserable, we almost by definition are very, very happy. So thank you for increasing at least our happiness index up here on the panel, Thomas. Delio, you're really profiting from the fact that you're sitting next to me, because you are allowed now just a very brief interjection.
Yeah, it's very often forgotten that we already have had a similar adjustment going on over the last 10, 15 years. And that was Germany doing the opposite. Germany, for a very long time after the unification boom petered out.
But the Germans love being miserable.
I don't think so. They had 10 years in front of them of the adjustment, which now the South has to do. So the question is, if it's possible in one country, why not in another?
Now Jürgen, you made these very interesting remarks, which I fully applaud, about various commissioners and fiscal union, political union. It sounds like all very good things to suggest just while you're about to leave your job. But can you just sketch out this? And also, who's going to join? It seems to me that the only countries who are going to join some greater fiscal or political union are those AAA countries that don't really need it. But maybe I'm totally misunderstanding you.
It has my remark on this, on the political union. To go ahead with European integration has nothing to do at all with the fact that I announced to leave the ECB. You know, this was an important topic in the discussions on and the negotiations on the Maastricht Treaty. to move in parallel with monetary union on the one hand and political union on the other hand. But there was no political consensus at that point in time. Just to remind you, you were at that point in time monitoring very closely what went on. So I'm a bit surprised that you limit it now to me.
I've always said that to make monetary union work, you need a political union.
The second point I would like to make, I don't like at all this distinction made and the new division that comes up between North and South. We have just overcome 20 years ago the division between East and West. And I find it extremely dangerous, not only from a political point of view, also from an economic point of view, and from an integration point of view, to talk about these North-South issues. We are facing problems. We have internal balances which have to be addressed, and please, you have seen already in one of the graphs that there is the gap seems to be narrowing. Whether this is sustainable, persistent, I don't know. But we see already, as a result of the adjustment in countries, in the so-called deficit countries, we see already a reduction on of the imbalances. Second point in this context of Germany, I think this was due to the impact or the effect of reunification in 1990. Germany run current account deficit for many years and returned to positive territory in the current account only at the end of the 90s or in the year 2000. But then, let's say 10 years ago, the reform process started. The reform process started in bringing back price competitiveness, which Germany had lost after unification. So it was a correction process. It was a correction process and indirectly, not explicitly, but indirectly also an adjustment to the conditions of a monetary union. And in my view, other countries have to learn lessons from this experience.
Thank you. I would like to bring up a point that Jacob has also mentioned, and maybe we'll do that in the final 15 minutes. And maybe it has a lot to do with the ECB, whether the ECB has had to do too much, because it is clear that the ECB has had to shoulder an immense burden. And now the EFSF is coming along, maybe that will make things better. But before we do that, Jean, you mentioned also how long and difficult and arduous it would be to get public debt levels, say in Italy, down to 40 or 50%. It's the same question as to Jürgen. Does Europe collectively have the stamina, the patience, the will, the moral fiber to get over what could be a 10-year journey?
Well, as we say, I mean, there's a price adjustment, relative price adjustment, and there's a fiscal adjustment. And we shouldn't forget that both have to take place. And there's a question of priority and balance. On the price adjustment, Daniel and Jürgen mentioned the experience of Germany. We may wish to go back earlier to countries in a fixed exchange rate regime. It all started in the 80s, and Jean-Claude Trichet became known because he was the man behind what he called at the time competitive disinflation in the French case. In the previous 10 years, it was France struggling with real exchange rate adjustment. So we know it takes place. We know it's a very long cycle. It's much too long a cycle, but it can take place. Now, I think that the problem we're facing in some Southern European countries are beyond what we have experienced so far. And that's why it's justified, I think, to speak of a Southern European problem, because it goes beyond. I mean, the relative prices between France and Germany, or perhaps Italy, are of the order of magnitude we know. But the other ones are of a higher order of magnitude.
Also, Jean, in a recent paper, you pointed out that this is really having a big impact on the financing of firms around Europe. It's not just the sovereigns, it's also, it goes to the core of the single market, doesn't it?
Yes, I think what we have to be very worried about is also the fact that we're seeing fragmentation taking place. The interbank market doesn't work, and the same bank with two corporate clients on two sides of the border gives credit at very different rates because the marginal cost of funding is not the same anymore throughout the euro area. So it is fragmentation taking place.
No, thank you. I'd like to mention that point, which Jacob will talk about overburdening monetary policy, but I would also really like to have some comments from the floor, either from our Polish hosts or indeed from anybody else. One big question, of course, to our Polish friends, and here I would quote Marx, Groucho Marx, has anything that you heard here today made you more likely to become a member of this particular club? Because, of course, Groucho Marx very famously said, I wouldn't like to become a member of a club that would have me as a member. And so I'd like to hear the answer to that, also in the light of what has been said about the two-speed Europe and so on. But please, I'd really like some points of view from ladies and gentlemen. Ruud Lubbers, the Maastricht was mentioned, and Ruud, you were the Prime Minister of the Netherlands at that time. Many of us very much regret that you didn't become the head of the European Commission thereafter, but that's another story. You don't have to go into that one so much, but please, we're very much looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you so much. Very shortly, I was impressed by Jürgen when he signaled that in any case more discipline is needed and that it's high time now to organize that. Now there are proposals, as we know, from Merkel and Sarkozy about Van Rompuy, a special member of the Commission, but it's all crossing a line to a new situation where we repair, as it were, the mistakes of 1991. Mr. Stark said there was no political will, but I think we have to be a little bit more precise. Those days, President Mitterrand wanted the euro, but he didn't want any power outside France. So he went for l'Europe des patries, and that is still was there. But if you want to go forward with European integration and a more powerful Europe, you have to go beyond l'Europe des patries. And that was the essential idea of Maastricht. I remember very well that those days, your own Chancellor, Helmut Kohl, for good reasons, I think, preferred to be nice to Marianne. They were standing there hand in hand. Then I thought, okay, we'll do the euro first, the single currency. And then in course of time, we will discipline ourselves and take the necessary measures. It didn't happen. We got a stability pact, but it was not really about stability. It was to give possibilities not to go for stability, both in France and Germany. There was another chancellor those days. And so it went on. And you said, already 5 years ago, speaking on behalf of the ECB, we warned the politicians. Here I want to be a little bit harsh. This is not enough, cautioning people. You have to be stronger as a European Central Bank and say, if we have to instrumentalize the financing of countries who have a lack of discipline, we are not going to accept that. Okay, I think Mr. Trichet, his decoration here, was a great guy. But I look back to history, those were 2 weak people. So it's now high time, and I follow your advice, to make the necessary steps to go forward. One last point. If we have still this l'Europe des patries, it cannot mean anything else than that the IMF has a role to fulfill to these states. And we have seen in the past that a country like Italy, but even, David, UK was disciplined by the IMF. There's nothing wrong by being disciplined again by the IMF. So I think this is to joining the two things, IMF intervention with control, discipline, and for a European stronger attitude where the incoming president of the European Central Bank, I would advise Mr. Draghi not to accept the job on the terms of today and said, I really need more power. And then he requires, of course, his counterpart in Brussels, and the two of them could work out the things Jürgen Stark just said. So these were my few remarks. Thank you.
No, well, thank you, Ruud. Actually, yes, thank you. Yeah, but a round of applause. You have also indirectly asked the question that Jacob was burning to answer, because you're saying you'd like the ECB to be even more powerful, whereas he seemed to be saying he thinks monetary policy could be overburdened. So maybe we'll go back to that, because I'm sure you're burning to give the answer to that question. Anyway, Jacob, thank you for also mentioning the UK, because of course in those days, $5.3 billion, that's what we raised from the IMF in 1976, that was shock and awe. That was big money in those days. And you know, Britain never actually drew down that credit because confidence returned, because Britain got in front of the markets, ladies and gentlemen. We got in front of the curve. So who else would like to raise a question? I really would like, yes please, yes gentlemen there, just with the microphone in your hand. Please say who you are, because you're probably not the former Prime Minister.
I'm not. Krzysztof Rybinski, former Deputy President of the National Bank of Poland, and now President of private university. You ask an opinion of a poll, so I give you one. When I look at your recipes, what EU and Italy in particular should do, which is have a price adjustment, which is let's call it to extreme, some small deflation, maybe 1% a year for 10 years. With low growth, it means maybe falling nominal GDP or stable. If rising debt, it means very high likelihood of rising debt to GDP ratio. To stop it, you have to have a primary surplus, maybe, I don't know, 8% of GDP, large. And you say, this is my recipe to solve the situation, nobody will buy this story. So unless, and next year Italy goes in Greek footsteps. So you ask a poll, would we join the Eurozone, which has such recipes to solve the situation? The answer of a large amount of citizens asked if they are able to grasp the seriousness of the situation would be, of course not, unless you have a better idea. Now, my idea to solving this problem is very simple, and I would like to ask you the question, what do you think about this idea? I've been writing about this for quite some time. Europe needs new euro. Greeks exchange 2 old euros for 1 new euro, Italians 1.5 for 1, Germans 1 for 1. In 5 minutes, you solve the problem. Greeks and Italians restore competitiveness. There's one technical issue, how to make the transition, but that's a technical issue. Thank you.
Well, you do know that there's an eccentric British lord with probably more money than common sense who's giving a prize of 250,000. Yeah, and you've got the form, have you? Because I think they're being sent out as we speak to the National Bank of Poland. I'm not sure whether the prize is in euros or in pounds, but we'll come back to that question in our final round. Anybody else like to raise a point or put a point of view? Because we are now coming into the final. Please, from the fourth row. Thank you very much. And then we'll answer all these questions as we wrap up.
Krzysztof Kwieciński, an independent economist. Have the recent ECB operations resulted in debt monetization? If so, what is its magnitude and what measures are necessary to prevent it? Thank you.
Have resulted in what?
Debt monetization. Debt monetization. Perhaps one last question or one last point of view from the audience before we have our... Is there anybody? Yes, please, sir. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so it's sort of Jan Michalik from University of Warsaw. Maybe one additional sort of follow-up question was...
Could you maybe put the microphone slightly closer to your mouth? Thank you.
The type of follow-up question. I mean, with respect to the comment which was made that, in a sense, remedy for a balance of payment deficits could only be the lower rate of inflation in the south and higher in north, which, as was said already a moment ago, would require, as I understand, more restrictive fiscal policy in the south and much more expansionary fiscal policy in the north, because there is no other solution. But this would mean that if we follow up, that the level of unemployment in the south would be higher, while the overheating of the northern country would be even more obvious. So then the only solution, if we come back to the original theory of Oka would be simply a higher level of migration, or let's say labor market flexibility, people moving from south to north, which might be a long-run solution. So would it be a part of the, in a sense, plan how to remedy the balance of payment misalignment in a long-run perspective? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those 4 points. We're now going to go in reverse order, so we're changing around the east-west balance. I make it that we've got 10 minutes left. Each of you have 2 minutes to reply to those questions, and you might like to just choose one of the questions. One was on monetization of debt, one was on the inflation differentials between North and South, one was on the technical issue of potentially changing these present arrangements, and the first one put by Prime Minister Lubbers was about more Europe. So, Jean, you can start first. You have 2 minutes.
Okay, two points on the powers of the ECB. I think the ECB is a powerful institution with a clear mandate. Overburdening the ECB is a risk. If the governance in general of the euro area is weak and the ECB is strong, at some point it's going to lead to a challenge to the model of the independent central bank we know and we think has to be maintained. So I think there is a risk of overburdening the ECB, and what we're discovering is that for a central bank to perform and to thrive, it needs an institutional environment that is also up to the task vis-à-vis the other policy fields. To Christoph Rybinski, the new euros, the 2 euros, or the 3 euros, the flow issue obviously would be helped. I mean, the price adjustment would be helped. Now you have to think also in terms of stock, of financial stocks. And the one field in which the euro has been extremely successful is in fostering financial integration. So claims, cross-border claims, not only to states, but between private agents have developed enormously. On average, within the euro area, gross exposure to the rest of the euro area is 100% of GDP. Now, if you start converting into new drachmas or new whatever, or pseudos, or you're basically transforming a balance sheet that is in balance into something different in a quasi-random way, because a company that had issued bonds in euros domestically would get the new currency. A company that had issued the same bonds cross-border would still have liabilities in euros.
Okay, Jean, you've overstepped the mark now. I would say that you get together in the break and work out how you're going to win this prize.
What I'm saying is that just, it's very simple to say the competitiveness problem will be solved. You would create a much larger problem of financial imbalances and a chain of bankruptcies.
No, thank you very much. And that is really a good answer, I have to say. Jürgen, we're expecting you to stick to the limits here of the 2 minutes. I'm going to ask others to give you some tips of what to do in your retirement, so you don't have to go into that question so much. You might like to talk about the debt monetization issue, perhaps, if I may make that recommendation.
I will answer the questions raised, not your comment on your remark. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Lubbers, for your comments, which I appreciated very much. You were closely involved in the Maastricht process, so you know better what I put in my terms as there was no political will. So from January 1st onward, can be as explicit as you were to be more outspoken and really to address the issue at what was at this point in time. So there was no agreement, but then in Maastricht there was an agreement to have the Amsterdam Treaty, quote unquote, in order to repair what was not achieved yet, namely the political union, progress in political union in Maastricht. Second point on to give more powers to the ECB, I agree with Jean. I must say we have already a heavy burden on our shoulders. We have delivered on our mandate. We have delivered price stability, and there is a risk in putting more power to the ECB, to give the ECB more task or more instruments. The central bank will get closer to politics and would risk in the end its independence. And again, let me stress that we are accountable for price stability, for this objective.
Could I stop you there, please, Jürgen? Because you don't have to answer every question.
For this, okay.
No, thank you, because I have been asked to try to wrap this up. But I think that was a very good pièce de résistance on which to end. Thomas, your chance to say a few closing words in 2 minutes, please.
Yes, I'd like to address the question about migration. Yes, it is part of the adjustment mechanism. The more deflationary pressure you put, and I continue to use that, on the South, and the more rigid the wages there are, the more emigration out of the South you produce. And my last sentence, if I may, David, I think what we will be confronted with is choosing the optimal point between these trade-offs of reflating the North, deflating the South, and making transfers. And it's going to be the politicians, policymakers' task to find this overlapping point of finding the right mix that will preserve the euro and avoid this disintegration that the other gentleman who had this plan for solving the problem overnight will avoid.
Thank you. That's excellent. Jacob.
I will address one question, which is the overburdening of monetary policy. I think it's a great danger. I think that the reality is that when you ran out of ammunition, interest rates are already zero, budget deficits are large, debt is large, the temptation is, let's activate the instrument that is the most activable. And obviously you look at the printing press. It's not an accident that over history we have learned that there is a fundamental social benefit of having an apolitical central bank which is strong, that has a long-term perspective, and it is protected from the short-term imperatives of the political process. And I think we should really continue to protect it, because if you look just at track records, those countries that maintained the virtue of central banks that stick by their mission performed in the medium term better. I want to make one point on this, because some people say there is an analytical case to depart from this principle. And it is always said, suppose you have an orchestra and there is a violin and a trumpet and everyone plays according to the music and there is great harmony. And then suddenly the most important instrument starts playing off tune. Of course, there is no harmony. And fiscal policy is completely disarrayed. Question, what should be done? Should we force and make pressure on the conductor to tell the fiscal policy that good instrument come back and play by the music? Or should we say and show understanding, well, it's difficult politically. Why don't we change the music of all other instruments so as to accommodate this distortion, and we will restore a quasi-harmony? In the short run, it is tempting. In the medium run, the violinist will never play the right music if somehow we found another solution. So I think that overburdening has to be assessed in terms of the long-term cost, not the short-term cost. And finally, 20 years ago, we had Steve Jobs, we had Bob Hope, we had Johnny Cash, and today we have no Jobs, no Cash, and I don't know about Hope.
Well, thank you, Jacob. I wonder how many times you've told that joke. Yeah.
I sent it by the internet, so then suddenly people tell me that.
No, but I would like to suggest also that we no longer take the Ode to Joy as the Symphony of Europe, but we should actually take Mahler's second symphony, the Wiederauferstehung Symphonie, Resurrection Symphony. That should maybe be the symphony, because there is a lot of apparent cacophony in that symphony, but it all ends with great harmony. Daniel, you have the massive privilege of being last to speak, apart from me, and you're allowed also to give some tips to Jürgen Stark about what he should do in his retirement. So bring that into your 2 minutes, please.
I will certainly refrain from the latter. I would say that what many people have identified as a key challenge is this mix of reflation in the north and deflation in the south. I come back. It has already been done over the last 10 years, between 1995 and 2005, in Germany. And contrary to many impressions, it was done in Germany through the market. Government reform, structural reform, all these things came in very late in the act, and their effect, I think, was very limited. So if you let the markets work, this can be just have to have the last 10 years with opposite sign for the next 10 years. And the challenge is, can we have enough financing so that the financial markets don't collapse in the meantime? If we have this mixture which Thomas mentions, then I think we can pull through.
Good, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We've come to the end now of our first session. I'd like to sum it up simply by saying more Europe, more discipline, more market, and more Germany. I've thoroughly enjoyed the session. I hope you have. I feel, though, stimulated, but not totally satisfied, shaken but not stirred, apart from by Jacob and his raw magnetic animal power when he was striding the stage. I was stirred and shaken by that. I would like to thank all our panelists for a marvelous discussion. I think we have taken the story forward, and we look forward to the next stage after lunch, where we will be attacking the principles of supervision, regulation, all those wonderful things. Thank you so much, all of the panelists. Thank you, audience, as well, and enjoy the lunch break.